Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner, the research director at California YIMBY, also ledge director now, but we'll talk about that in another episode, and one of the co-leads of the new Metropolitan Abundance Project. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, Ned Resnikoff and I chat with Richard Kahlenberg. He's an education scholar, director of the American Identity Project, and the director of housing policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. He's also the author of the new book, Excluded: How Snob Zoning, Nimbyism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. It's a fantastic new book, highly recommend it. In this episode, we'll be chatting about the persistence of economic segregation, the connection between housing and education, and what, if anything, the federal government can be doing about all of this. As always, please like, subscribe, leave a review. We especially are keen to hear who you'd like to have on the podcast in the future. And I think we've done enough episodes now to where we can maybe even start bringing back previous guests. So if there's anybody that you particularly liked, let us know. We do read the comments and we appreciate the feedback. Of course, also follow us on social media. We have the Metropolitan Abundance Project on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, ditto for California YIMBY. Reach out to us and stay connected. With that, on to the show. Rick Kahlenberg, thanks so much for joining the Abundance Podcast. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're chatting about your new book, which is fantastic, Excluded: How Snob Zoning, Nimbyism, and Class Bias Builds the Walls We Don't See. I want to start off at a really, really high level here, right? So I think most people get a general education of, here in the U.S., we had a lot of explicitly segregationist policies. We said that, whites and blacks had to consume different private and public services. They had to live in different parts of the city. But then in the 1960s, we passed the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and all of that was supposed to have gone away. And I think your book actually complicates that narrative and shows how in many cases some of these segregationist outcomes persist, but potentially even without mentioning race. So at a very high level, I'm wondering if you could just sort of share the general thesis of Excluded.
Thanks. And thanks so much for having me on the show. There's been a lot of great work looking historically at the role of race in segregating American society. And I'm thinking in particular, Richard Rothstein's terrific book, The Color of Law, talked about the ways in which redlining, racial zoning, racially restrictive covenants, all were designed to keep Black and white people separate and unequal. And it's kind of treated as a relic of the past. Something, it's part of our disgraceful history, but now we've passed laws that try to address those questions. But what I try to do in Excluded is talk about the ways in which we have intense class bias built into our laws that has a racially disparate impact. I have a whole chapter in the book on the ways in which Black people are particularly hurt by exclusionary zoning. But at the same time, I think the racial lens is by itself is too narrow, because exclusionary zoning is fundamentally designed to separate people by income and to artificially boost housing prices by limiting the supply of housing. So historically, we had racial zoning in this country. In Baltimore and elsewhere, there were explicit laws that said if you were Black, you could not move to majority white neighborhoods. Thankfully, the Supreme Court struck that down in 1917 in the Buchanan decision, but municipalities quickly found a workaround, and that's what we have today. Economic zoning that makes it illegal to build multifamily housing in large swaths of the country, imposes minimum lot size requirements, and all the things that your audience is well familiar with.
Well, so let me ask you this. I think somebody encountering this issue for the first time, they might say, okay, yeah, absolutely, racial segregation, bad, good that we got rid of it. But there's a lot of aspects of our life where we're segregated on the basis of class, right? I can't afford to join a certain country club. I can't afford certain restaurants. It's not very nice, but it's not something where we feel like we have this maybe shared obligation to intervene, or maybe some people do, right? But I think most people would say, yeah, sure, you can't afford the restaurant, you don't get to go. What would you say to somebody who would say, yeah, hey, I worked hard to be able to afford a home in this very, very nice neighborhood, and now you're telling me that anybody should have a right to come live here no matter how much they earn? I think most people on this call would disagree, but I think it's a very widely held view, and you hear it articulated a lot at city councils meetings and public hearings. What would you say to that person? Why is housing different, or the way that we manage housing different?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that to the extent that certain houses are more expensive because they're bigger, they're more desirable, located in certain areas, yes, the free market in housing by definition discriminates based on income, and that's the way markets work. I don't have an objection to that. My major objection is to government laws that forbid the construction of any kind of housing that could be more affordable to those of lesser means. And so it's putting the government's imprimatur on the idea that certain neighborhoods ought to be off limits to people who make less money. So that's kind of the bigger messaging problem with exclusionary zoning, is it says that certain people are so beneath others. Those who are of modest means are so beneath those of who are wealthier that it's okay for government to effectively exclude them, to build walls to keep them out. The second piece of this is that, as you well know, housing is directly connected to opportunity in America, and we're saying not only people who make less money are going to be excluded from entire neighborhoods, but also their kids are going to be excluded from the opportunities that come from living in a safe neighborhood with strong public schools. And so I think that's the other piece of this that's deeply concerning from a moral perspective.
One of the things that you point out in the book is that this type of snob zoning, you call it, is more prevalent in blue parts of the country than in red parts of the country in many cases. And one of the places you call out as a particularly bad actor is my home state of Connecticut. I was raised in central Connecticut, and as always was dismayed but unsurprised to see it make the list for having things in some jurisdictions like a 3-spot parking minimum for a studio apartment. I think, though, Connecticut is maybe an interesting case because it's a solid blue state now, but up until the late 20th century, there was very much a strain of, I think, sort of moderate business conservatism, especially the parts of Connecticut that are a bit closer to the border with New York. So the more affluent suburban parts of the state, which makes me wonder, are we getting the causal relationship backwards sometime when it comes to snob zoning? That it's not, oh, these blue states have restrictive zoning because of something to do with liberalism itself, but for some reason, some of these places that were more inclined to have restrictive zoning decades ago are now becoming more blue. I'm just curious how you think about that.
I take your point. I think that in some cases that can be true, that the zoning laws were often put into place a long time ago. And so you'd want to look back retrospectively at what the political makeup of communities are. Having said that, this is one of the issues that I found really energizes people. This finding is not my finding, but Jenny Schutz and others have established very clearly that politically blue areas have the worst forms of exclusionary zoning. It touched a nerve, and so people are looking for a lot of explanations. And I think yours, Ned, is plausible, that in some cases, not all, but in some cases, the bad guys might have been more conservative. But that still doesn't explain why the laws persist to this day. The other thing I'd say is that there can be mixed motives here, even when predominantly liberal areas have bad zoning laws, and we can tie it directly to the liberalism of the community. There's some positive explanations one can point to. Liberals care more about the environment, I think is a good thing. Liberals often care more about small d democracy, and therefore want to have a process by which decisions about the community ensure input from lots of different people. So I think all of those are legitimate reasons why you might find exclusionary zoning worse in predominantly liberal areas. But there's also a lot of emerging social science research, which I think is more troubling. And so there is evidence from experimental research that with higher levels of education, which today is associated with political liberalism, that you see reductions in racial prejudice, as one would hope and expect, but also increases in negative attitudes towards those who are less educated. And in the book, I quote, Fareed Zakaria, who points out, if the cardinal sin of the right is racism, the cardinal sin of the left is elitism. And I think there is something going on, certainly in the persistence of exclusionary laws in politically liberal areas.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to put a finer point on that, one difference I've noticed now living in California between the Bay Area and Connecticut is that in the Bay Area, NIMBYs are typically a little bit more sophisticated and they know not to say certain things when they're opposing housing. But when I'll go back and I'll read an article in the the Hartford Courant or the Connecticut Mirror or something where people are talking about their opposition to affordable housing down the block, people who I think would describe themselves as fairly liberal are often feel licensed to speak in pretty shocking ways about people with less education or lower incomes. And often there is a very distinct racist undertone to what they're saying. And I always kind of wonder what the disconnect is there, because these are folks who, in a lot of cases, I'm sure are very enthusiastic Kamala Harris supporters. What's your theory on why there's such an intense disconnect for them between the values they might espouse on Facebook or whatever about racial equality and class divisions and how they actually behave in the context of local land use?
I think that's a great question. I might interpret it a little bit differently. My experience with people who live in exclusive communities, highly educated, liberal communities, is that the motivation isn't racist per se. So that is to say, they affirmatively celebrate when there's a Black doctor down the street. That's a point of pride for a lot of these folks. And that's progress in this country. It didn't used to be that way. But I think by focusing on race exclusively, we end up missing the fact that there is deep concern about working class people of all races coming into a neighborhood. And I quote Omar Wasso, who's at Berkeley, in the book, and he says, in exclusive liberal communities, we love our Muslim neighbors so long as they're millionaires. And I think there is something like that going on in the exclusionary zoning. Just to complete that thought, that you really see the difference in terms of immigration, where people would be completely opposed to building a wall to Mexico are perfectly happy to defend these invisible walls that they erect around their cities.
Right. You early on in the book, you quote Michael Sandel, classism as the last acceptable prejudice. I'll continue my role as this sort of hypothetical NIMBY at the public hearing here. To what extent, are these attitudes motivated by the real or perceived variations in the way people behave, right? So, for example, I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, racism is intolerable, suggesting that there's racial differences on certain behavioral margins. But yeah, lower income people are going to not maintain the property quite so well. They might be more disposed to commit crimes. The pupils are not going to be as engaged in school. That's going to lower the quality of the school. Yeah, I mean, again, not particularly nice things, but things you hear quite commonly in public hearings. To what extent is that real? To what extent do you think that motivates that? And to what extent are these perceptions actually valid to any extent?
I think that is part of what's going on. It's not just that wealthier people look down on those who have are less wealthy. It's that they are concerned about particular questions of crime and academic achievement and all, and the types of things that you mentioned. To me, it's fascinating to see how we handle that issue, with respect to race versus class. So one can cite empirical studies which find that there's a racial achievement gap in this country, that on average, Black students perform less well. One, if so inclined, can point to differences in crime rates by race. But as a society, a long time ago, we said, yes, there might be these statistical relationships, but because one Black person, because Black people as a group might have lower academic achievement, it's simply immoral and wrong to assume that every Black person or Black people who want to move into the neighborhood are going to share those characteristics. And so we were able to make clear that it was really improper to paint people with a broad brush, even if there was some statistical empirical analysis one could cite. And with respect to class, we haven't made that cultural shift, which I find fascinating. I had a piece in the New York Times on exclusionary zoning, and all the types of arguments that you're articulating, Nolan, came up quite clearly with respect to income. And people would write in and say, you don't understand. You've never lived among poor people. And there was one guy who said, their dogs bark louder, which I thought was a little odd. But in any event, the New York Times comments section would not, I hope, have allowed people to write in and say that Black people or Hispanic people have certain characteristics. But there was no problem allowing people to write in with a very broad brush about those who are less economically fortunate. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to write about a number of single mothers who have, by all measure, what people would call middle class values. They wanted better education for their kids. They were not criminals. They wanted to get out of a neighborhood that was, where there were high crime rates. So I think of those individual mothers and their kids when I hear people say, oh, but poor people as a group just act and behave differently than the middle class.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. What do we know about trends here? What are we, generally speaking, especially post Fair Housing Act, are we making progress on or moving backwards on racial and class-based segregation?
Well, so there are conflicting trends here. So on the one hand, the good news is that racial segregation has declined by about 30% since the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And I should be more precise there. What I'm talking about is data that look at the Black-White Dissimilarity Index. At 100, that's pure apartheid. At 0 is pure integration. And it's gone from 79 in 1970 to 55 in 2020. So 55 is still a high number. It's bad. It should go lower. We have too much racial segregation in the society, but it's headed in the right direction, at least, a 30% decline. Meanwhile, Sean Reardon and others, he's a Stanford researcher, has found that there's an increase in income segregation, basically a doubling of income segregation. And that by that, Reardon means that there used to be more mixed income communities, people of different economic backgrounds living side by side. And now the poor have pulled off in one direction, and the wealthy in particular have isolated themselves from those who are middle class and low income. Decreasing racial segregation, increasing income segregation. And if I can just follow up with one other point here is, I think our public policies are partly there to explain this trend, because we do have we have a Fair Housing Act to address racial segregation. We really don't have legislation to address class segregation.
You brought up schools a little bit earlier, and you say in the book that education disparities are in large part a housing story. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yes. So by way of background, I've spent about 30 years writing about education. That's my bread and butter. One of the key findings in the educational research is that what matters even more than how much a school spends per pupil is whether low-income students have a chance to be in economically mixed schools or in high-poverty schools. So it's enormously important who your classmates are. And low-income students who have a chance to go to middle-class schools are between a year and 2 years ahead of low-income students stuck in high-poverty schools. And I spent most of my career writing about using public school choice. So these are not private school vouchers, but public school choice, things like magnet schools and charter schools where you can choose to go outside of your neighborhood. And I still support those efforts. They're good. But at the end of the day, 3/4 of American school children attend neighborhood public schools. So as long as our houses, our residential areas are segregated by race and by class, our schools will tend to be segregated by race and class. And given the enormous body of research suggesting that's hugely problematic to equal opportunity, I just finally had to, belatedly get to the field you guys have been researching and writing about for a long time, because housing policy is school policy. I'll just cite one other example of this that really drove it home for me. There's a study of Montgomery County public schools right outside of Washington, D.C. And the community is a progressive community that cares about low-income students. And they have two interventions to improve academic achievement. One was to spend $2,000 extra per pupil for good things like reduced class size in the early grades, better professional development for teachers. And the other intervention was a housing intervention, inclusionary zoning, which your audience knows well, is an opportunity for low-income families to live in middle-class communities when there are inclusionary units built in a middle-income area. And a researcher at the Rand Corporation tracked these two groups of low-income students who were in public housing through the inclusionary zoning program, who were in middle-class areas versus those in higher poverty areas. And even though they were spending $2,000 more per pupil in the higher poverty area, the kids who got to go to the economically mixed schools did far better over time. They cut the achievement gap in half in math with the middle-class kids, by a third in reading. I said, okay, I've got to dig into this more. And I think it's enormously important that we address our housing issues if we want to address our schooling inequalities.
I don't have 30 years of background in education, but I did, before I worked on housing full time, work briefly at the Legislative Analyst's Office here in California on K through 12 issues. And it's the California context is pretty interesting. I'm curious if you have thoughts about it, because here we have the local control funding formula. So by and large, school districts that do have more low income students actually do receive more money, in some cases significantly more money than school districts with uniformly middle or high income households. But at the same time, the achievement gap in California has remained pretty stubborn. And I was tasked with looking at this in my previous role, and it was interesting to note, well, we have about twice as many school districts in California as we actually have municipalities. So even as school districts with more low income students are better funded, and even as segregation within districts is going down, segregation between districts is growing. And at the same time, you have in a lot of these higher income districts, you have these intense housing crunches that are keeping out all of the kids from low income households. And it does seem a little bit strange to me that we've spent so much time and energy trying to solve this solely through the channel of education policy, and expecting schools to essentially compensate for pretty entrenched housing segregation.
Absolutely. I should be clear, there is evidence that money works in education. It's just that integration matters more. So I would favor what California is doing, spending more money on the higher poverty districts. But the way to make real progress is to address the housing segregation and the exclusionary practices that result in educational segregation. In the book, I talk about an example in Dallas where it's so stark because they have they call it the donut hole within the city of Dallas, this affluent enclave, Highland Park, that has its own school system. It's very, very affluent. The students who are quite nearby come from real concentrated poverty, and yet the reason that there is they can't access, low-income families can't access Highland Park is the basic outline of almost all multifamily housing. And I don't want to overstate this. Clearly, property values are connected to school quality, so it's a complicated relationship. But fundamentally, even if the way to get into this high-performing school district is to be able to afford a extremely expensive single-family home.
I had a student, and Rick, you have real expertise here. I had a student who did a paper on this in a California planning policy class I taught last semester. The term paper was essentially looking at, okay, we've tried to take a lot of these steps to improve equity in education outcomes, but then we know that persistently one of the main determinants of where a person sends their kids to school is the length of time it takes to get them to school and the available transportation options. And the student was making this very effective case of, we say we support even public school choice, but then in many cases, the best public schools, even within a given district, are certainly here in Los Angeles, for example, are completely surrounded by R1 zoning, where the starting price for a home would be $2.5-3 million. And then we all are supposed to pretend why we have these crazy equity issues in larger school districts like Los Angeles.
That's absolutely right. I mean, they're supposed to be public schools, and they're public so long as you can afford the $2.5 million price tag, which doesn't sound very equitable. It's a pervasive problem throughout the country, and I've been interested to see how the housing community and housing activists think about the education issue. I did a series of reports for the Gates Foundation on the relationship between exclusionary zoning and educational opportunities in New York State. The polling is complicated on this, to the extent that when we talk about the relationship between housing and education, it, in a perverse way, can activate exclusionary sentiments on the parts of those who have a good deal. That is to say, their kids are in high achieving schools, and they're nervous about risking that. And one answer, I think, an important answer to that, is that the research evidence says that low-income students do not negatively affect the achievement and outcomes of middle-class students, at least so long as there's a critical mass of middle-class students in the schools. And moreover, that when, particularly if it's a predominantly white, wealthy school district, that the students are missing out on something that's vital to a high quality education, which is learning from students who have a different set of life experiences. There's a whole body of research on the benefits of diversity and racial and economic diversity to learning. And so it doesn't have to be zero sum where every benefit for a low income student somehow comes out of the hides of middle class students and wealthy students.
That's an important point. I mean, there's almost this sort of like, sometimes it's framed as like, well, you're going to have to accept a little bit of inconvenience to have these low income students have more opportunity here. But to your point, there can be benefits for the even middle and upper class pupils in these schools. It's interesting to me when I'm reading some of the most interesting parts of the book are sort of this intersection with education, because that's an area where you have a lot of expertise and it's relatively new. It's interesting to me when I think about the history of post-Brown education, right? There was some awareness of, okay, yeah, we have to actually diversify our schools, right? And I guess the first attempt at this is busing, right? Of like, we're just going to, yes, our cities are totally segregated as a result of 100 years or so of policy. We're going to solve this problem by just moving everybody around. And then we stop doing that, I guess, for the most part. But then we don't ever solve the underlying land use issue that made that a challenge. And I'm wondering, have we just fallen into a sort of suboptimal equilibrium of like, yeah, okay, the schools are going to be segregated. Busing was controversial and difficult, so we're not going to do that so much anymore, but we're not going to address our underlying land use patterns. I mean, when you talk to education folks, what's their sort of perspective on what, if any, change needs to happen in housing and land use?
Most of education reform is about kind of enforcing Plessy versus Ferguson. So it's let's accept the fact that these are separate schools and just try our best to make them equal. I think there is increasing conversation among educators about tackling housing policy. Here we have the driving force behind educational segregation. We just had the 50th anniversary of the Milliken versus Bradley decision, which involved the Detroit public schools and the surrounding suburbs. That was a decision in 1974 when the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to require school desegregation to go across school district lines and include the suburbs. I was just reading an article about the case, and the judge in that decision, who was in the lower court decision, who wanted to desegregate, did point to a number of housing policies that were at the root of the educational segregation. But the Supreme Court drew this artificial line between school boards on the one hand and local government housing policies on the other, which was deeply unfortunate. I do think busing, compulsory busing, certainly has a bad name, and for some good reason, because families weren't given any choice in the matter. Their kids were sent across town, and a lot of times it was working class families who felt like they didn't have a lot of power in life to begin with. So it's not as if the desegregation era, was perfect, but the ideal of integrated schools is enormously important, not only for reasons of academic achievement, but also because of fundamental issues related to our democracy. I think, back to 2016, when Donald Trump was running against, he wanted a Muslim ban, and he wanted, he was calling Mexican immigrants rapists and murderers. Not that he stopped doing that, but that was central to his campaign in 2016. And you had to wonder if more white Christian students had gone to school with Mexican American students, with Muslim students, and become, if not best friends, at least acquaintances, whether there would have been less appeal to on the part of a demagogue who tried to demonize certain populations. It's a whole lot. I mean, I think that was the big lesson of the gay rights movement, was that when people started coming out of the closet and people became much more aware that uncles and cousins and friends were in fact gay, that the effort to demonize entire populations became much more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and certainly something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about in both the education context and the housing context, because Something about our existing land use patterns is not only are schools still pretty segregated, and especially our school districts, but the pattern of how housing is built in the United States makes it so that other than schools, there are fewer and fewer spaces where you're actually going to have any sort of meaningful interaction with someone from a different class background, or depending on the area, someone from a different religious or ethnic background than you. And that does seem like it goes some of the way toward explaining maybe why multiracial democracy in the United States has, after a decent run of a few decades, come under intense threat. So I'm curious how you think about that democracy piece in the context of housing in addition to education.
Yeah, I think that the polarization, economic polarization, but also political polarization is connected to our inability to bring different types of housing into communities. There's been this research going back a number of years now, finding the ways in which people cluster by ideology, and increasingly so. And that has real problems for our democracy, because when you, and I'll be honest, I don't know that many Trump supporters in my neighborhood, and I think that's a problem. I think that any of us would be less likely to judge individuals harshly if they spent time talking about their kids' sports teams, over the backyard fence. I just think that the ways in which housing policies help drive separation by education level have big implications for how we begin to view one another in terms of differing politics. And that translates into democracy, or the strength of the democracy. Because if you think your political opponents or adversaries are evil, not just they think a different way, they're evil, then it's much easier to take shortcuts. And this is mostly, I think, a problem on the right, where we had a president who didn't want to go along with the peaceful transfer of power, and people who demonized, those on the right who demonized liberals felt like it was okay to take that shortcut. It also happens on the left, and on campuses, you can have students who are liberal, who are willing to cut corners on free speech protections and shout down speakers just because they, those speakers have more conservative views. And so I think I don't want to pin this all on housing, but housing is the increasing ways in which residential areas are divided politically has implications for the health of our democracy.
And maybe this is a good segue to talking about persuasion, because one of the things I really love for your book is that it's written for normal people. It's not written for people like me and Nolan who marinate in these issues all day. And I do think that sometimes if you are plugged into housing Twitter, then the conversation can get pretty insular. So I'm curious how you think about approaching this challenge of talking to your neighbors who live in single family homes about this sort of thing, because it is true, as we've discussed before, people with certain abstract political beliefs, something else can very easily get triggered by any perceived threats to their neighborhood or their property values. So can you talk a little bit about how you tried to approach that challenge in the writing of the book?
To my mind, a lot of the people living in exclusionary communities are not bad people who are actively involved in excluding. I think there's definitely some of those folks, but I think most don't spend a lot of time thinking about zoning issues. They kind of just think that, well, I've made a certain amount of money and therefore I can live in a certain type of neighborhood. And of course, all the houses are similar and we all have big lots, and that's just the market at play. And it doesn't really matter. What I try to do in the book and when I'm talking to people is to tell stories about those who are hurt by exclusionary zoning, because they're mostly invisible, I think, to a lot of, even well-meaning people living in exclusionary neighborhoods. And so the ways in which, for example, the fact that that certain types of housing are banned, that lot sizes are so large, mean that some individuals have to live way out on the periphery of metropolitan areas, and that they have these terrible commutes that end up, increasing the rate of heart attacks, divorce, to say nothing of the impact on climate change. Telling the stories about the low-income single mothers, all of whom have jobs, all of whom work hard, all of whom care about education and want their kids to do better, but they're stymied by exclusionary policies. And so I think it's important. I've been talking about the importance of not demonizing. I don't think it's good to demonize people living in exclusionary communities. I think most, or many, I should say, can be persuaded that the policies are harmful, and we're seeing evidence of that in a lot of blue states and some red states now, where we are seeing some change.
Well, let's dive into that. So by now the audience is thoroughly depressed about the state of American housing policy and education, and but so you've actually covered, I think, an exciting counter trend, which is what happened in Minneapolis in the late 2010s. You want to share sort of, what was so transformative about Minneapolis, and especially why did it happen?
Yeah, well, Minneapolis was, a typical urban area. 70% of the land was set aside for single family only, for single family homes, and nothing else could be built. There was a groundswell of change that came about from a number of different forces. And I think what excited me about Minneapolis was the coalition they put together for change under the rubric of Neighbors for More Neighbors. And your audience is probably familiar. Minneapolis, the end of the story is they were the first major city to legalize duplexes and triplexes, and also, it turns out, more importantly, to allow some more dense development near transit and make some other reforms. But it was a beautiful coalition of young people who understand better than anyone the ways in which exclusionary zoning artificially increase housing prices. And so you had a young mayor, young council members who understood the problem. Minneapolis is it's an overwhelmingly Democratic city. I think there was one Green member and the rest were Democrats. So it was generational. There was originally some opposition from older Democrats who thought that the way the zoning had been done for years was the way it should always be done. And then you had labor unions get involved. So SEIU, the healthcare union, had a lot of workers who worked in the hospitals in Minneapolis, and they're the people who were their members, the employees who were providing medical services, who were from working class backgrounds, were having to take two buses to get into work, and they'd often miss work if they missed the bus exchange. So housing was a huge issue for labor. This was before the murder of George Floyd, but Minneapolis has a concern about racial justice, a longstanding concern about racial justice, and civil rights groups and others who are concerned about civil rights did a great job of overlaying the old redlining maps that kind of quarantined Black people in certain areas and robbed them of the chance for wealth. they connected that to the fact that the green zoned areas were almost all single family exclusionary today. There were educators who got into the act too, pointed out that 14 of the 15 high performing schools in Minneapolis were off limits to those who couldn't afford a single family home. And all these different groups came together and made some change. Importantly, there was some incremental change that had happened earlier. The accessory dwelling units, the ADUs, were legalized first, and there was a lot of fear around that initially. There's one council member who said, "Well, these are going to become houses of prostitution." That was the big argument made against ADUs, and that did not happen. And so, as a result, that made it easier for people to go along with some additional reforms. So Minneapolis is a success story in that regard. And then it's not in the book because it's more recent data, but Bloomberg just said Minneapolis is the first city to tame inflation, and they pinned that primarily on housing policy. The fact that Minneapolis had allowed that there was further growth in housing than nationally meant that rents had increased much less than they had nationally. So in many ways, Minneapolis is a success story. The footnote is there actually haven't, there's some legal complications and it's not a perfect story, but it kind of opened the floodgates for reform in lots of different places.
Well, we survey how people use ADUs, and it's only about 7% they're used for prostitution. So that's no. There's a kernel of a broader point there, which is when these reforms are first proposed, right? People were you get the most kind of hysterical reactions to them. But right now, you look at most of what's getting built in Minneapolis, and it's like, oh, okay, more apartments are being built on corridors, a handful, probably not enough missing middle has been built. Like, that's actually the concern now, not that, oh yes, every single family home in the city's been flipped. Yeah, something that I was really interested in Minneapolis, I totally didn't know about this, but the Metro Minneapolis region had actually already had some history of trying to institute a fair share mechanism for housing, almost not unlike Rena in California or Mount Laurel in New Jersey. And I was really surprised by that there was actually somewhat a long history. When I think of Minneapolis, certainly before 2020, I wouldn't have thought of Minneapolis as this metro area, Minneapolis-St. Paul, to all of our beautiful St. Paul listeners, as this metro area that's been reckoning with racial equity for a long time. But there actually has been, and much more explicitly on the angle of class, which I think is the frame that you bring to the conversation.
That's right. Well, I grew up in a suburb of St. Paul, and Minnesota is a fascinating state. I mean, that area is it's got some of the best and the worst. So there are a lot of people concerned about racial justice. Hubert Humphrey was from Minnesota, Walter Mondale. There's a long tradition of that, but there's also lots of forces for reaction too. So it's a mix. I don't want to suggest that it's, of course it could happen in Minneapolis, but can't happen elsewhere. Because I think, now we've seen evidence that it can happen and reform can happen in lots of states, including, of course, Montana, where we have, very conservative state adopting change as well.
And you talk about Charlotte too, which is another great counter. I don't think most people would see Minneapolis and Charlotte as, in any sense, peer cities. But you talk about some of the sort of radical pro-housing equity reforms that have happened there.
Yes, and Charlotte did put racial justice right at the center. It was a more divided vote in Charlotte than in a lot of places, but they did manage to pass it. I worked some with the Charlotte public schools over the years, and what really drove reform in part there was that Raj Chetty at Harvard did this study of what are the levels of social mobility in different parts of the regions of the country, and Charlotte came out dead last. I think it was 30th out of 30, and people said, wait, given that Chetty also tied social mobility to segregation levels, said we've got to do something about that. And so I worked with the public schools on a modest effort to integrate the schools through the magnet programs, but the much bigger lift is to deal with housing segregation.
Since you mentioned working with racial justice groups, let's talk a little bit in more detail about that, both in Charlotte and in Minneapolis, because I think this is an area where there's maybe a lot to learn for YIMBY groups nationwide. Oftentimes there can be some tensions between YIMBY organizations and tenant unions or other older community organizations. And I'm wondering if from your research you found any useful tips for how to build bridges there and piece together larger coalitions.
Well, you're absolutely right to point to the tensions, and in the book I do talk a little bit about some mistakes in California, the legendary read the bill chanting that I think most YIMBYs now recognize was a mistake. But in Minneapolis and elsewhere, there was a conscious effort to reach out to community groups. Part of there was a whole package of reforms. So part of it was missing middle and zoning reforms, but part of it was tenant protections. There were some provisions to increase the amount of money spent on subsidized housing. There were efforts to make sure that zoning reform didn't unintentionally exacerbate displacement in gentrifying areas. So there are a number of things that I think sensitive YIMBYs can and should do to build alliances. And probably the most important thing about Minneapolis, which I neglected to mention earlier, is that they brought in a whole new group of people, many of them people of color and working class people, to attend meetings. And one organizer described that as the secret sauce of why Minneapolis succeeded. There's all this research suggesting that the people who show up at meetings, zoning meetings, honestly, they look like the three of us. And although they're more like me because they're older too. And that's a problem. And so Minneapolis made conscious efforts to really make sure that people who might not have been involved in the process of government decision making were made to feel comfortable. So little things like wearing T-shirts of a certain color so that you could, once you got to the meeting, you didn't feel isolated. You could go be with your people, and reaching out to street fairs and going to churches and other community gatherings to get input, and avoiding a lot of the jargon that so many of us fall into. They never use the word density, for example, in going out and talking to regular people about housing issues. So all those things were important in Minneapolis.
Normally, we do stress this: don't say density, don't talk about FAR. But I will say, former President Obama used the word units in his DNC speech, which was tickling my housing policy spidey senses. I was like, oh, he's using this. He's actually reading Jerusalem Dempsey or someone, right? So yes, not the best messaging tool, but for those of us who follow this issue, we were like, oh, okay, this is good.
Continuing to talk about coalitions and maybe getting a little bit into what's going on in the Democratic Party. I'm interested to hear your perspective on this as someone who has spent some time in DC and national party circles. We're kind of removed. We're a little bit removed from that out here. And so from your perspective, what's happening in Washington right now when it comes to the spread of YIMBY thought among, it seems, some very prominent elected officials?
I think one has to distinguish between the congressional level and then the executive level. So at the congressional level, there's you all know some modest pieces of legislation, things like the YIMBY Act. which are bipartisan. You have Republican senator from Indiana and Democratic officials from Hawaii and elsewhere coming together for reform. And so one of the wonderful things I think about zoning reform is you can, I guess it was Yuval Levin from the American Enterprise Institute said this, you can come at zoning reform from completely opposite ends of the political spectrum and arrive at the same policy conclusion. I thought it was a profound point. So I might talk about racial justice and economic justice, and my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Ed Pinto, whom I work with, will talk about deregulation and property rights, and one can agree on the ultimate idea. So at the congressional level, I think we see some progress. At the presidential level, this is kind of I think we're as Vice President Harris has made this issue more salient, we're seeing a classic YIMBY versus NIMBY. I mean, it's so wonderful that, in my view, that Vice President Harris has said that she wants to facilitate the building of 3 million new housing units, and that she probably said homes. She probably didn't say housing units, and that that there's a recognition of the importance of increasing supply. I don't agree with everything she's proposed, but I think that she's clearly planted her foot firmly, and President Obama reinforced it at the convention in the YIMBY camp. I mean, it is a huge victory for YIMBYs. It's hard to think of a more raw NIMBY type than Donald Trump, who has not gone along with this congressional consensus and continues to talk about the importance of making sure that we don't, quote unquote, abolish the suburbs. I don't think he's talked about suburban housewives of America this round, but that was his raw appeal to fear about race and class and the suburbs. I think we'll see more of that. Back in the 2016, there were those two folks from St. Louis who had brandished guns against Black Lives Matter protesters, and I remember watching the convention, and then all of a sudden, one of them pivoted inexplicably to, and we need to defend single-family zoning, and so there's that. Trump is the ultimate NIMBY. So they're both betting that their appeal is the more politically powerful one, and we'll just have to see how it all works out.
And I do have to point out, just as a sidebar, that Trump is also a developer. So for people who tend to think that there's a simple binary between developers are YIMBYs and then tenants are not YIMBYs, Donald Trump sort of puts the lie to that.
Well, that's right. I remember in talking with activists in Minneapolis about the coalition that was put together. I said, well, of course, developers were part of your coalition, and they said yes, but the camp divided. They wanted to be clear that there were some developers who love the current Byzantine system as it is because they benefit from it. I mean, I think in Trump's case, it's just the kind of the raw racism and classism is winning out here. But there is a profound irony that someone who builds for a living has not embraced the build baby build that the Democratic Party now has.
Yeah, there was a weird sort of moment, and he did a Bloomberg interview recently where they were like point blank, why are housing costs so high, and you could tell he was sort of returning to old developer mode of oh yeah, the permitting's really difficult and all the reviews, and he used the word bookkeeping, which I thought was interesting. Bookkeeping, increasing the cost of bookkeeping. I think then it's right back to okay, we're losing the suburbs. What does the polling say? How do we stoke sort of unhealthy divisions here? Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's
immigrants too. He talks about immigrants. Right. That's the other big thing. Immigrants are taking all the housing, and I thought there was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times you may have seen, which pointed to research. Actually, immigrants disproportionately build our housing. If you round up all the immigrants, there are lots of reasons why that's immoral. But in addition, in terms of housing prices, it's not necessarily going to work the way Trump wants it to. I'm sorry.
Well, and there's a certain part of the MAGA wing, right? It's almost this know nothing housing policy of like, well, it's all it's immigrants buying or living in homes, it's Chinese foreign buyers, it's Wall Street coming into your neighborhood and buying up all the homes. I mean, it really is kind of the classic kind of know nothing playbook. And I do want to stress, and I think you're aware of this as well. Certainly, there are a lot of pro housing Republicans who, exactly to your point, understand the issues here. But I do think it's incredibly dangerous, sort of the trajectory we're on, where one party's come around, great, they get it. The Democrats, I think, at a high level have started to understand this, potentially much to the chagrin of local exclusionary Democrats in some states and cities. But at the other side, we have the opposite happening with the Republican Party, where a lot of local Republicans at the city and state level get it, and they can vote for good stuff. And I mean, exactly, you raised the Montana piece, but then at the top of the ticket, you have this classic, just hard Nimbyism. And to me, it's scary because, as with some progress that's been made on other issues, certainly like education as well, you're going to have a certain degree of bipartisanship to actually get this through, even in a state like California, but certainly in the vast majority of the country.
Yes, absolutely. And to me, one of the things that attracted to me to writing about housing was not only the education angle, but also the possibility of interesting political coalitions. I don't know if you can see it behind me, but I got my Robert Kennedy 1968, Robert Kennedy Sr. Poster. And in college, I wrote my thesis about his ability, running for president, to bring together working class, Black, Latino, and white voters. And that was the coalition. And I'm oversimplifying here, but that was part of the coalition in Oregon. And it's my understanding it was part of the coalition in California as well. That is to say, the efforts at reform were primarily motivated by Democrats. But it's my understanding in both California and Oregon that you would not have had reform pass but for a modest number of Republican votes, and that those Republican votes came disproportionately from representatives of working class white people who may have wanted to stick it to rich, hypocritical, liberal, exclusionary areas, but also care about housing prices and also don't want to be looked down upon.
Ned, what do you say? Is it time for lightning round?
Yeah, perhaps it is. Maybe I'll kick it off by asking most underrated city.
So is this? I'm not familiar with your lightning rounds. This had nothing to do with housing, or is it?
The questions are generally housing or city adjacent, and it's just sort of rapid fire questions.
Housing. Now, I'm sorry. I'll give the predictable answer. Minneapolis.
Where should we get lunch in Rockville?
Rockville. Well, there's a wonderful Thai chef place right in downtown Rockville.
So, living in the greater DC area, what's your favorite thing about DC? Like, what's a non-touristy thing that people should do when they visit DC?
Oh gosh, I love Great Falls, which is along the Potomac. Just you feel like you're 10 minutes from bustling areas, but you're in a completely different world.
If you could put one book on education policy, let's, for the sake of conversation, say not one of your own books, which are all fantastic, on the desk of every policymaker in the country, what would it be?
Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities, which begins to talk about not only inequalities in spending, but also with respect to segregation.
Maybe less of a lightning rapid fire question, but I am very curious. Now that you've written a great book about housing policy, are you planning to do more work in this area? Can we expect more books about housing from you?
Well, I actually have a book coming out on affirmative action in higher education next year. That now that the Supreme Court has struck down the use of race, what can universities do to create economic and racial diversity? But I'd love to do more work on housing and talking with folks about creating a bipartisan task force that would look at some of the success stories, also some of the failures that locally, and see are there broader lessons both for communities that want to try to engage in reform, but also at the federal level.
Well, this might be purely to the benefit of Ned and I, as I know Ned is working on a book, and once you've written one, you start working on the next. You're an incredibly prolific author. What's your process, right? Maybe top and users. We'll go back and add a timestamp for people who don't want to hear about the process of book writing. We'll return to federal housing policy in a moment here, but yeah, start to finish. I'm curious, how do you think about this, right? You've clearly got it down to a flow. Topic identification, the day-to-day process, how does that work for you?
Well, I'm very predictable. So I'll just say in terms of coming up with an idea, in 1984, before you guys were born, I was writing about Bobby Kennedy, and he had this insight that with passage of civil rights laws, class was going to really become the major issue. And so I've looked at education, labor, housing, affirmative action in higher education, and that's been a theme for me. In terms of kind of coming up with an inspiration for an idea, I'm just spinning off a one idea over and over again. But in terms of the process, the fun part obviously is just reading everything you can on a new topic, and I benefited from reading stuff that both of you had written in the housing arena, and then I think it's really important because the research is so much fun to start writing pretty quickly, just jotting down stuff, because otherwise you can go on for years doing the research, and then you have to, you're eating your dessert and then you have to eat your spinach, and that to me is unpleasant. So I try to do writing along the way, outlining, and it shifts a lot, but that's something important. The last thing I'll say is that I'm someone who's motivated by statistics and by data, but I recognize I'm an oddball in that respect. With Excluded and with this most recent book on affirmative action, I've really tried to be conscious about telling a lot of stories, because that is what convinces people, not the data. So that's been a new element to what I try to do. And that's the hardest part. Finding families who've been affected. I had a research assistant who helped me with that, and I just introduced me to a number of families, and that ended up being kind of the most rewarding part of writing the book, was to talk with people who were living with a lot of pain because of our current policies, and it serves as a point of motivation when you can talk to people whose lives could be changed if what you're advocating were actually adopted.
Well, I could talk about writing craft for hours, but there are other podcasts for that, and people are listening to this one because they want to hear us go into the weeds on housing and urban policy. So maybe pivoting back to that, I wanted to talk about one of your proposals at the end of the book for the Economic Fair Housing Act. What is that?
So the Economic Fair Housing Act would give people who are hurt by government exclusionary zoning laws the right to sue in federal court to seek to upend those exclusionary practices. So it's modeled after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which makes it illegal for both private landlords and private homeowners and government to discriminate based on race. And it takes a piece of that and says government should not be able to exclude people because of their income without sufficient justification. So this is a little bit technical, but under the Fair Housing Act, there's something called the disparate impact law, where you don't have to prove that the government intentionally was trying to exclude Black people or Hispanics, but rather that that's the effect. And then if there is an effect of exclusion, the burden shifts to the municipality to justify, come up with a good reason for why they need that law or that practice in place. So to make this concrete, if a town banned all multifamily housing, that's clearly going to discriminate based on income. And so a plaintiff could bring that case, and the town would then have the chance to say, well, the reason we've banned all multifamily housing is, and they'd probably come up with some excuse, that we need to reduce traffic, or, they would come up with a rationale. But under the law, they'd have to show that their exclusionary practice was necessary to achieve a legitimate objective. And I think in many cases, the exclusionary practices would fall. And this has worked in with respect to racial discrimination. There are cases where municipalities have had to change their zoning laws because of the racially disparate impact.
This may be one area where our thinking on this issue diverges a little bit. And so I'd like to maybe give you an opportunity to sell me on this. One of the concerns I have about this approach and similar approaches is whether we are relying too much on private right of action to solve problems that should instead be more sort of automatic regulatory actions. I don't know. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I'd say a couple of things. One is the Economic Fair Housing Act is meant to be one tool, and it's not meant to replace the various reform efforts that go directly at public policy. I think the Economic Fair Housing Act adds a couple of dimensions. One is it, in part by using the fair housing language, is meant to help shift the culture so that, after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the acceptability of racial discrimination, the legitimacy was reduced dramatically. So at the time the bill was passed, there were lots of people who responded to pollsters and said, no, Black people shouldn't be able to live wherever they want. I don't agree with that. And over time that shifted. And this, I think, was a case where the law helped shift the culture, in addition to the culture allowing for passage of the law. So I think it's important in that respect. On a more pragmatic level, I was talking a while back with the California State Senator Scott Wiener, and he said, I said, well, what can the feds do to make your job easier of passing reforms at the state and local level? And he said the threat of legal action works wonders, and that you could have a municipality where even the people in power would like to do the right thing, but they feel like politically they can't. To have the ability to say, well, if we don't make this change, we're going to get sued, and it's going to cost a lot of money. That's a powerful lever for change. So it's not so much that I would expect lawsuits to proliferate across the country. What I would hope for, and go to trial and everything. What I would hope for is the threat of lawsuits to bring about changes in behavior. I don't know if I made any dent in convincing you, but you're being polite by not Not coming back with 12 argument.
No, I think that's reasonable. I think, it's certainly private right of action needs to be a tool in the toolbox. And as you said, the threat of consequences can often be really, really powerful. I just like to push back on these sorts of things every once in a while, because I think that one of the real problems with housing policy right now is that a lot of it is planning by lawsuit instead of planning by thoughtful planning processes.
I'm definitely in agreement with you on that point, and just see this as another tool.
The point that you made there that I think is really interesting, which is exactly this of like the law changes and then attitudes shift, right? I suspect, right, on almost all the issues that the three of us spend all day thinking about, most people basically never think about this stuff and they're going to default to the sort of common sense of like, well, of course there should be white and black neighborhoods. And then the law changes, and that's like the signal of like, hey, there's this broader shift in thinking that's happening here. Unless you have like strong feelings to the contrary, get on board with the program, right? And I think that's partly actually what's happening with zoning stuff as well, as people were like, if you had asked most folks 10 years ago, oh yeah, should vast portions of our cities be restricted to single family homes? They would say, well, duh, of course. And then a city changes the law and they're like, oh yeah, actually, I'm reconsidering my preconceived notions about this policy for the first time. I mean, I think we're actively living through that, and certainly younger generations have totally different attitudes. Returning to you as our DC Capitol knower, I'm curious other things that the federal government can do. I think you're expanding right of standing for some of this stuff is really, really valuable. There are a lot of conversations about federal carrots and sticks on housing reforms. I'm wondering your perspective on that and what you see potentially being viable going forward. Certainly now that a Harris administration might be fully bought into the program.
Yes. Well, I mean that is the most immediate step is not an economic fair housing act, but rather incentives for communities who are on the verge of potentially doing something constructive and bringing more housing, bringing more equity to their process. I think that's positive. I'm glad that Biden and now Harris have been making these proposals. I do think you need some powerful sticks in addition to the carrots, because you only move the communities. The carrots are unlikely to persuade, Scarsdale, New York, which is incredibly exclusionary, to take action. But a powerful stick as a complement to that could make a difference as well. But I think the first step is, what's reasonable to do in the short term, and incentive programs are, they're a positive step, and then just kind of political science 101 is you create a constituency. Once some communities are getting some money, others want it too. And so you've got a built-in lobby for continuing the program. And every member of Congress and state senator who has beneficiaries from a particular program is going to be more inclined to continue to support funding. So I think it's a reasonable place to start. I just hope we don't stop with incentives.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at, I think, some of the concerns some folks have, and Jenny Schultz, who you mentioned earlier, has sort of raised this of the most popular proposal is, well, let's tie community development block grants or CBDG grants funds to zoning reform. And it's like, well, the richest jurisdictions are not dependent on CBDG funding if they collect it at all. I think I'm never going to miss an opportunity to push it now that this issue has federal salience. I've suggested, okay, bring back SALT and mortgage interest deduction. That's a big issue for certain moderate Dems, but tie it to a housing affordability outcome that we care about. Either you have affordability levels at some threshold, or you're building, or you have some share of units that are deed restricted affordable, sort of like the Massachusetts model. Right. But I mean, this is, it feels like to me like a very open field, actually, and it's an exciting area of policy where it seems like could go in a lot of different directions. But exactly to your point, if we just take, we've kind of been doing the carrot stuff for decades, right? Like there's periodically been grants to encourage more pro-housing funds, right? I mean, going back to the Douglas Commission, right? And it's like, hey, you might actually have to have a carrot in here once in a while, and maybe that's like a private actor suing you for violation of class discrimination. Maybe that's okay. Homeowners in this jurisdiction are no longer eligible for certain federal benefits.
Right. Yeah. No, I love your idea. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it was Jack Boger at the University of North Carolina was talking a number of years ago about making the income, the interest deduction dependent upon taking steps to reduce exclusionary zoning. And I just kind of I had assumed, well, that's not going to work anymore. But you're absolutely right. If it became an important part of the tax code again, then that would be a powerful lever to get change. And it would go almost most precisely at those communities that need the change the most.
Here's a crazy idea I'll just throw out there that I think gets at some of the questions around education and housing that we've been discussing. High income school districts that receive any sort of federal grant money, automatic upzoning within half a mile of the schools themselves.
Wow. Oh, I think that's really intriguing. So there is this research in particular around the gap between affordable housing and strong schools. But if you're bringing upzoning to areas right near schools, that could have really positive impact on economic and racial integration as well. I like that.
Yeah, and also I think in California, obviously we attempted to do upzoning within half a mile of transit stops, and I think there's opportunities to do things like that at the federal level, as long as you're talking about agencies that are receiving federal funding to get around the Commerce Clause. But one of the advantages of doing it for schools, in addition to doing it for near transit stops, is make it so that kids can walk to school again.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's the biggest opposition to integration is the transportation involved, and you're tackling several problems at once there. Ingenious.
Wow, we're just cooking. I hope federal policymakers are taking notes. Pull over if you're driving or riding a bike. Rick, I'm curious. What did you change your mind on over the course of writing this book? Was there anything where your perspective shifted as you did more research into the topic?
Well, this will be a very telling admission. But because I came at this issue from an education perspective and come from someone who's deeply concerned about segregation, that was really what drove me nuts about exclusionary zoning. And it was only after reading, it wasn't after very long, but that I discovered that's not motivating very many people. And this is all about affordability. If you talk to the average person, of course, this issue is one of affordability. But to me, that was something I came to after my original interest in segregation.
Yeah, I think that certainly the thing that I feel like I most learned from your book was, of course, broadly speaking, the intersection of housing and education, but just the extent to which, if we're going to say there's some school choice, access to schools is just so like physical proximity to schools. It seems almost too obvious to even need to say, but it's like, well, if you're saying, oh yeah, hypothetically low income household in, impoverished minority majority part of the city, you can go to affluent white majority school across town, but there may or may not be any public support for you to get there. Even if there is, it's going to be 30 to 45 minutes of your child sitting in, traffic. And then, by the way, we're not going to let any housing that you could possibly afford get built anywhere near there. And you really sort of drill this home of, certainly, of course, among cities in a metro area, but even within a large city like LA or a large city like DC, these issues are just as salient. And I worry that, we got to keep both sort of context in mind. And I think you do a very good job of that.
Yeah. If I can add one other thing that occurred to me that surprised me, it's that people who are pro-housing would be hyper-focused on the ways in which exclusionary zoning is prized by what is now the Democratic Party's base, upper middle class, white liberals. To me, it's so obvious that the Democratic Party should be the party of working people, and that's central. But when I proposed the Economic Fair Housing Act, I got pushback from pro-housing forces, who said this is not the right tactic because exclusionary affluent liberals are they're the central core of the Democratic Party today, and we can't go after our own base. And it was a very clarifying moment because it underlined for me why we have to go back to the Bobby Kennedy coalition of working class, Black, Hispanic, and white people. That exclusionary policies, which do such harm in terms of making people's lives miserable, in terms of affordability, cutting people off from opportunity, increasing racial segregation, that all those considerations should be set aside, because the reality is we'd be going after our own people. Scarsdale gave 70% of its votes to Biden. And so we can't mess with that. And I guess I was kind of astounded that people would say that out loud rather than just maybe thinking it. But they did. So that was a surprise as well.
Well, I think thanks in no small part to your work that this attitude is shifting a lot. I mean, if we had had this conversation 3 or 4 weeks ago, I might have been a little bit more cynical about pathways here within the Democratic Party, but housing has just become so preeminent, and I think it's almost obvious in retrospect, right? This is any given family's number one line item. It's the one area where we have lingering inflation. As you mentioned, the cities that are building are overcoming this. It does seem like this issue is really, really improving. Again, and thanks in part to folks like you making this case of, hey, if we're serious about our claims about believing in equity, we can't leave housing and where we build it off the table. Rick, the book is Excluded: How Snob Zoning, Nimbyism, and Class Bias Build the Walls We Don't See. Fantastic book. Rick, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for the great work you're doing.
Thanks, Rick.